I want to pick up on some of the points here. Maybe starting with IFAC and then on to the ESRI. But, Mr Barnes, you expect a surplus of 4.5 billion this year, is that correct? And that is taking on board the €2.5 billion contingency fund that was put into the budget last year, that would be spent.
Yeah.
Okay. So to summarise this, if the government spends €2.5 billion on one-off cost of living measures between now and the end of the year, where IFAC still project a €4.5 billion surplus this year.
That's correct.
That's it. So basically, the stance that the government set out last year in terms of expenditure would be kept.
It would stick to their original.
They would stick to that. But the big difference is that instead of being €8.3 billion in deficit, would be €4.5 billion in surplus. So he would have had a turnaround of close to €13 billion to the better.
Well, there is this change that they introduced in the summer, which was that there'd be an additional 400 million permanent spending brought forward from the budget into 2022. But beyond that, it's the same as budget plans.
Which, yeah, okay. So, just to, you know, I think for a lot of people out there, they're looking at, well, when the minister stood up on the floor and says we expect a budget deficit of next year of €8 billion, and we can't go back to this situation of if we have it, we spend it, but €8 billion, and obviously that was an issue. We had to reduce the deficit. There was a pathway there, and we have seen a bonanza. We've seen a bonanza of €13 billion turnaround. Yet the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council are saying, don't do anything more than what you planned last year in your contingency fund, which is €2.5 billion. That isn't going to cut it for a lot of families. That isn't going to stretch. When we're looking at prices increasing for average families of over €2,000, that's not going to cut it in terms of one-off measures, is it?
So I think it's a very reasonable question for people to answer, and so let me try and explain to you why this is the appropriate thing, even if it's a difficult message for people to hear. Firstly, I think in terms of the public finances, a much better measure is to focus on the balance without the excess corporation tax. So that's important in terms of, particularly when focusing on permanent measures, as we discussed with Dr.
But on this point, and just because I will come on to permanent measures, this is one-off measures.
Exactly.
So
just in terms of the context. So in some ways, a better measure of some of the forces that are going on in the economy is really there's a deficit of 2% of national income, which is a very different picture, which is attributed to the size of the wedge. But I think the real constraint here comes down to the issue of not triggering second-round impacts on inflation. And so if we pump too much money into the economy, and you can argue where too much kicks in, in fact, the more money you put in, the more inflation you will have. And these policies risk being counterproductive. And the ultimate,
is that always the case? And sorry for interrupting, but like, if you put, say now you don't do what you're suggesting, just use the €2.5 billion. Say you do €4 billion, but it's properly targeted. Then, like, if you're offsetting the price increases of energy for the low income deciles, you're not creating an inflationary pressure. It's only if you do what the government did the last time, which was 90% untargeted, that you're creating inflationary pressure.
Whatever money you put into the economy in some ways will contribute to higher inflation, and that's the constraint. And the difficulty here is that the underlying problem is that energy and food, which are things that we essentially have to have, everyone recognises that, we import. Particularly the energy. And so the difficulty is when it goes abroad, when the prices go up, the people who gain from that are not people in Ireland by and large, they're people in other countries that sell us oil and gas. And so there's a net loss to the economy, and that has to be paid for somewhere. So it's a loss in terms of, so we can't fully compensate everyone for the fact that these prices are higher, because there's a net loss to the economy. And that's really where this constraint is coming from in terms of higher inflation. Now, to be clear, what we're not saying, you know, a really textbook thing might be not to provide any help and just let it ride through. We're not saying that. We're saying, you know, there is a legitimate case both to help the more vulnerable households, but actually to smooth this shock, which is very big, right? People are going to find very big bills landing on their doorsteps during the winter. So there is an understandable, you know, there's a balance to be struck between how to manage the compensation and the inflation. Now, what the targeting does is it improves that trade-off. It means you can provide more help to those who need it most with the same amount of inflation compared to if you didn't target it. So you get a much better balance, but it doesn't change the fact that by putting more money into the economy, you're adding to inflationary pressures.
Okay, so how does the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council arrive at the fact that the £2.5 billion is the appropriate figure for one-off measures? Is it just because that was announced last year before we had a cost of living crisis, or have you done assessments on the impact of this crisis on these families?
So to be clear, we're not saying the £2.5 billion is the appropriate number. We're saying it's within the range of appropriate numbers, and there are trade-offs which people might strike in different ways. But what is clear is the more money you're putting in, the more you will be contributing to these kinds of inflationary pressures. And ultimately what we're doing is we're trying to use our professional judgment and looking at the kind of tools and models that we have. And we see that these kinds of measures would contribute somewhat to inflation. We know as well there's a lot of pressure and demand in the economy. The Irish economy is continuing to grow quite fast. And so we think there would be higher inflation as this, but not in such a way that would radically change the picture.
And
so
how will
it seems to us that strikes a
domestic
balance.
demand, which we're seeing contracting over the last while, and obviously the talk of potential recession and so on and so forth, how would that impact in terms of domestic demand?
So I think the one thing that it's important to bear in mind is that the Irish economy is in an unusual situation relative to other economies. Yeah. And there are parts of the economy that have been powering ahead for many years, including since the pandemic. And so that means we have a higher rate of trend growth. You know, we have unemployment coming down very fast. We have employment still growing. So the economy is in some ways performing quite well. Now, the winter is going to be a big shock when people do have these big bills. And exactly how bad it is depends on what happens to prices. It depends how cold it is this winter, how tight the energy shortage is. So there is a lot of uncertainty, and that's one of the reasons why we said the government should stand ready to take additional measures if things get much worse than expected. But at the moment, you know, we're not quite in that position. We think there is space to take temporary measures. You know, what the government has already put out there is one reference point, but it's not the only number that you could choose. But there is also this constraint that the more money we put into the economy, the more other prices are going to go up, and of course then we'll just be chasing our own tails.
Okay.
Just to add on that point, I mean, we aren't seeing a contraction in growth in the first two quarters. Actually, growth is still powering ahead, and it's even though it's moderating, it's still at a fast clip, the domestic economy. Yeah. And the other thing is, like, unemployment is at once in a generation low level. It's these types of conditions where you see pressures from the government adding more stimulus into the economy more likely to feed through into higher inflation again. So that's why we're kind of saying, you know, we don't have a perfect number for what the temporary measures might need to be in the future, but the government really needs to stand ready and watch for when there might be a turning point in the economy.
Okay. Do you have a number for the projection for the general government balance for 2023?
We didn't go that far ahead with the pre-budget statement, and that number, I would say, will change massively depending on what happens over the next coming weeks. Things are really hectic in terms of what the gas futures are saying, what the outlook is for the economy. It could change very rapidly. Okay.
If we go to now budget 2023 and look at the package that is outlined, you have an expenditure envelope of 2.65 billion. But when you take away the public sector pay deal, if it is approved, that takes that number down to about 1.6 billion. In the context of a cost of living crisis, in the context of a healthcare system that is falling apart, in the context of needing more investment in housing, 1.6 billion isn't going to cut it in expenditure. Like, forget about indexation, or, you know, like, that's not even going to cut it. Like, this is worse than standstill, because our hospitals are costing more to keep level because of the cost of energy. Our schools, our youth clubs, everything. You know, like, that type of support is tiny in comparison to what is required. 1.6 billion euro. Would you not agree? And how can you suggest that it is appropriate?
So the numbers that I would have in mind would be the core spending by the government. The measure the government has in the rule would go up by close to 5 billion next year, so higher than the figures you suggest. Now, what's true is if you compare that to the cost of fully operating pensions, pay and welfare to this year's inflation and to the sort of July forecast for inflation, that would cost close to 7 billion. Now, the public sector, but that assumes the public sector pay deal would be fully tracking inflation, which it doesn't. So if you do that, there's not much of a gap between the kind of full indexation of the pensions and the welfare and the government's other existing spending commitments around 2 billion and the envelope. So those things more or less line up. Now, of course, as you're right to say, that doesn't leave a lot of space for doing other things. Now, on the investment side...
Sorry, can I just make a point? Do you agree with the figures that the unallocated expenditure is 2.65, and if the public sector pay deal goes through, it's likely to come down to about 1.6?
Yes, so I think so I think the figures you're referring to are around the existing level of spending numbers as well.
Yes.
So we're not, it's a little bit unclear where those numbers come from, which is why I kind of set them aside, and they were, I think, based on lower rates of inflation. So I think those numbers are now outdated, I think, which is why I gave you what I think are the most useful updated figures. But the bottom line, as you correctly identify, is that doesn't leave the government a lot of space to do other things. Now, specifically on the point of investment, the NDP is still there, and the government is investing a huge amount by historical standards and significant amounts on housing. The main constraint there is probably actually a supply constraint on the ability of the economy to produce more housing. But anyway, that's a very specific issue. But in general, there isn't a lot of space for the government to do other things. And that's natural.
But sorry, can I just say this?
Deputy,
and I'll ask the
this is the final comment. Yeah.
But you're saying there's not a lot of space. There's not... We are in a far better position than last year. There's not a lot of space because the government have set out in their summer economic statement this is what they're going to do, and you're concurring with it. There is space if you want it. I'm dealing on the way up here with families in Donegal that are homeless, kids that are in hostels at this point in time, people who can't see a consultant for over a year. And then don't talk to me about the number of people who are just fearful of opening the envelope to see the bills. There is space if we want to. At 1.6 billion euro to deal with the crisis that we have, and I say this, Mr. Barron, because you're concurring with this, it's not good enough, it's not big enough, it's not going to cut it. The package is far, far too small, and we can wrap it up in billions and all the rest. 1.6 billion when you take in social welfare payments that have to be significantly increased, a tax package that needs to be directed at low and middle incomes, investment in health, additional capital for housing. It can't fit.
Mr. Barnes, briefly, please, because we do have to move on.
So our point is there is a real need to prioritise. As a consequence of higher energy prices, that essentially makes welfare payments and pensions more expensive to provide. And so if the government wants to do that, which I think most people would think is the case, that is going to cost them a lot. That means they have to make choices relative to other things. Now there are many pressing things facing the country, and this raises real questions about how that's going to be done. Of course, there are other ways of doing it. You could prioritise away from other spending programmes. You could also increase taxes. Those are all ways of doing it in a sustainable way. The danger just by spending the money that we have is that would add to inflation in an already high inflationary environment, and also would make us more reliant on corporation tax, which is essentially storing problems up for the future. So there is a very important debate to be had about...
Or you could raise tax on the wealthier, which would reduce inflation.
Okay, sorry, I've got to call into that section now.